Ladies and gentlemen, we are live. I am really looking forward to this conversation, and let's go ahead and do our 30-second countdown, get people to start tuning in. And as we start tuning in, we're going to be discussing Thor and Odin and potentially Loki. Who knows? We're going to be touching on some of this stuff, especially with the movie series that came out from someone who has done deep dives into their ancestry and the ancient history of Proto-Indo-Europeans. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go ahead and be visited by the gods. I wish I had Thor and Odin appear in this. Who knows? Maybe one day we'll add them to the scene. We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I have John F. White joining us from Crecganford YouTube channel. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much, Derek. Welcome.
Thank you for coming on, man. Look, all those books behind you are real. That's not a green screen. No, but seriously, you've read a lot of material and things I probably will never read about the subject. And I want to, don't get me wrong. I would love to be able to consume books like it's nothing. But this has been a thing you focus on. Absolutely. So sometimes when you want to know something from a brain scientist, you might want to ask them, not assume you have the answers. You might want to ask people who focus their research in particular fields. Mm-hmm. And so I definitely want to pull you on to maybe talk about not only the movie that really hypes people to know more about Thor and Odin and Loki, even if we can mention Loki in this, but how the mythology matches up and like what's the reality of the myths, the stories that we're going to dig into. But before we do, I want everyone to know down in the description, you guys, please go subscribe to his YouTube channel. He has loads of information here, hit videos, and he goes into tons and tons of stuff. He's got more ideas of what he's going to do. He's also interviewed Richard Carrier in the past as well. I've done interviews with him, and a lot of this material is quite interesting history. So he's done like extremely deep dives into this material, and he edits his material really well. So please, I ask, go subscribe, hit the bell. Make sure you guys tune in and check him out at Crecganford. And there's a lot of stuff about all of these myths. I must admit, I was watching the Viking series not too long ago. I binge watched the whole thing, and it's like the documentary channel something version of it or something. But there's Odin pops up multiple times with this patch over his eye, and he comes and he usually appears when someone's dead, like letting them know. Now, I don't know about the myths here. I'm just saying in the show, like he appears and like they know when one of their family ancestors dies or something because Odin appears. And it's like, they're not like, when they see him, almost like you see in the Gospels where someone sees Jesus like shine like the sun or he appears, they probably were in shock. No, they're like, oh, it's Odin. Oh, that means my dad's dead or something, you know, like. So tell us about Odin. Tell us about Thor. Where do we begin in the story? Do you want to start back in antiquity? And I don't know how you want to begin.
I have to, yes. So we'll start by saying the Odin of the Marvel movies and the Thor, the Marvel movies, and the Loki aren't really good really comparisons to what the myth was about and the religion was about over 1,000 years ago. So we had to have a little walk through to understand some of those differences, I guess. Now, if we start with all these are really complicated gods. You know, Odin, Thor, and Loki aren't your usual gods by any stretch of the imagination. They all have interesting stories, and they don't meet a standard pantheon of gods, as you'd expect. So, if you look, let's say, at the Roman or Greek pantheons, you know, you have a Zeus, and then you have his female sidekick, and you know, you have a warrior like Hercules, and stuff, but they don't map quite. Odin doesn't fit any of that,
Right?
And Thor has an odd position because most people think Thor is a god of thunder and lightning. I mean, Thor means thunder. His hammer Mjolnir, that can mean lightning, means to strike. So there's a guy whose name is Thunder, has a hammer that is lightning, but he isn't actually a storm god proper, as you'd call it. And so he is more of a sky god, what we call a sky god. So more akin to Yahweh, who's a sky god, or Zeus or Jupiter. But that sounds really odd to most people because there's Odin, and everybody's heard of Odin, and Odin's in lots of books and lots of films. So why isn't Odin the sky god? Why does he fit in? And so, and to understand that, we have to go really back into history, because Odin is probably not only the youngest god in the Scandinavian pantheon, but he's also the eldest god, or one of the eldest gods in the European or Indo-European pantheons. So he is a real mix. You know, he is both friendly and cunning. You know, he looks to trick people and gain his advantage, and he's always after knowledge. And so
Odin is
always knowledge is the thing. So that's always been his thing. But knowledge made him find out his fate. And once he found out his fate, which was the Ragnarok, which it means the end of the world, is how people can imagine a scenario. He had to do his best to then try and stop that, or to make sure he survived that. And that's where I think concepts like Valhalla came in. So before he knew Ragnarok was coming, he had no need to keep the best fighters. But when he knew Ragnarok was coming, then the belief came in that there was a Valhalla, and he picked the best fighters. And for Odin to get the best fighters, he would have to make sure the best fighters died on the battlefield, even though they're the best, so he could have them in his army for Ragnarok.
Oh man!
So yeah, this a really weird way. But that's, and if you think about that, that's a good way for people at the time to think, oh, you know, my father died in battle. He must have been a great fighter for Odin to kill him, because he must have wanted him for Ragnarok.
Oh man,
rather than think he's
wild. I wonder who came up with that. You know, you ever thought about like who created this idea? Was it some leader of the tribe who was like, look, we have to fight these people, whatever the reason is, for selfish gain or for survival, create this hope, but then it takes on its own mind of its own, the myth, and now it's like used over and over to try and like get people to go to battle and encourage death, so to speak. It's like,
it does, yes. Oh. So fate is a key concept of Old Norse belief and Old Norse culture. So they believe your life was fated. So as soon as you were born, the Norns, who were responsible for fate, understand the past, present, and future, they would carve your fate into the roots of the Yggdrasil tree, like this big tree that all the realms of the Old Norse world belong to. And so whatever happened in your life, fate would happen. So if you were due to die on December the 25th or something, or on Easter Day, that's a popular day to die for some religious people, that would happen whether you're sitting at home or in battle. So if it's going to happen whether you're sitting at home or in battle, why sit at home? You might as well go to battle and kill a few others and die. So that was the fate. Yeah, with this fate idea and this Valhalla idea, you know, it gave a good platform to fight. It made, you know, the culture was, you know, we shouldn't be afraid to fight, because if we're not due to die today, we're not going to die. And if we are due to die today, well, then we're going to die anyway.
How old is this fate concept that you know of, that you can trace it? So
the problem we have with Old Norse and what we call the Germanic gods, so we call them Germanic, so from northwestern European, so from sort of, if you look at Switzerland and go up vertically and horizontally along all that part of Europe, we have no real written history of that until Christianity came along, and they started documenting everything. And our best documents were written in the 12th and 13th centuries, so probably 200 or 300 years after Christianity conversion had pretty much sort of finished officially. And so there is a bias within these documents about what was written, and so we're not necessarily sure what was written was accurate. And even if it was accurate, the fact that it's written so long after the event, and even those events it was writing about were probably the end of a long period of that event happening, and so that may have changed. We really don't know. But what we can say for sure is that most academics leave Odin as the god we perceive him now. In fact, the god you would perceive if you watched a Marvel movie, that shape of Odin, that personification of Odin. He probably only started being around at the earliest, maybe 200 CE, so 1800 years ago. And it may have been even as late as 400 or 500 CE before he was actually created. And that doesn't mean he wasn't around in a form. It just means he wasn't around in that personified, the one eye, the cloak, the wide brimmed hat, the Gandalf looking Odin. That he was personified then, and that because we believe that happened through a cult of Odin. And the cult of Odin probably started in Germania, so in the lands around Germany. And that probably happened from a Roman influence of Mercury. And we can sort of say that with some confidence because Tacitus, a Roman historian, wrote in the sort of towards the end of the 1st century CE about what he saw in Germania, certain cultures and gods and things. And he actually wrote that the Teutons, which is another name for the Germanic tribes as a sort of whole, the Teutons, their Deus Maximus, their greatest god was Mercury. Now, there's something called Roman interpretatio, which is Romans explain things in the way they understand. So by saying the chief god of the Germanic tribes is Mercury, what they're saying is if you're in Rome and you saw Mercury, that would be the same type of god they were worshipping. And Mercury has a few traits about him that were perhaps slightly unusual. And we also know it's Mercury because Woden's Day, Wednesday, actually is often called, is it Mercredi in French, Mercury Day. And so we got this Deus Maximus of the Teutons was Mercury. And there are some inscriptions around about Mercury, Mercury Raven in effect. So in Germanic areas. So we're pretty sure there's this link. And Mercury was not only a messenger god, he was associated with ravens, and he was a psychopomp. So, in effect, he transported the dead. So, and this is where you start getting a sort of a link of a god who can help take you to the dead. Or, as you were talking about earlier, if someone died, he'd turn up, the messenger of the dead, telling you that.
Interesting. So he was a psychopath, you said? Or
psychopomp. He's called a psychopomp.
Oh, okay. I was like,
well, a necropomp in Latin. So necropomp. Okay. So that's the ferryman of the dead sort of thing. If you imagine, he's the person who takes your body to where it needs to go. And so he wanted bodies going to Valhalla. So that's where that story and those things started to happen, I believe. But that isn't the start of Woden or the start of Odin's story. As I say, he's also a very old god as well as being a very new god. So we can go back to where he very first started, and then we can try and fill in the gaps. Okay?
Yeah, let's do it.
So let's go back to the Proto-Indo-Europeans. So they started, or the very early start of them was around 6000 BCE. Okay, and they were a group of people who spoke a language we call Proto-Indo-European, and Proto-Indo-European, the proto means it's a hypothetical European. So we sort of working out. It doesn't mean it's the first language. Doesn't mean they were the first ever people or the first element of that. It just means hypothetical. So these Proto-Indo-European people, they had their pantheon of gods. They had a sky god and a thunder god and all these things, but they also had a myth of creation. Okay. And their myth of creation, how the world created, was fairly straightforward. It was there was a chaotic cosmos, and in the chaotic cosmos there was a primordial being called Yemo, which means twin. And there was a giant cow, and there's someone called Manus, who's first man. So you have the first man, this twin primordial being, and this cow. So that the cow also sort of represents, gives you an idea of when this started to happen, which was started after the early European farmers had started sort of sweeping across Europe and into the sort of Black Sea area, which is the Russian steppes, which is where the Proto-Europeans were. And so Manus, bored of floating through this chaotic cosmos, kills Yemo, and out of his body creates the world. A story that is quite familiar with.
Mesopotamians have the same thing with Marduk and Tiamat. But
Yes. So, and we could talk about that a bit because there's some confusion there of what that is, because most people think that is a dragon fighting myth, and it isn't.
It is.
Okay, because it is a creation myth. And the creation myth is different to a dragon fighting myth, and I'll explain why. Because Tiamat, it was actually a cow, not a dragon, and I can explain that if you want in a bit. So, but that's going a bit, that's diverging a bit. So, so the world is created, and what happens is Manus, having defeated Yima, comes down to the earth, creates people, but also becomes a priest figure, and through ritual sacrifice teaches man how to keep the world in order. I.e., if you can teach man how to sacrifice to him or to the gods, the world can be kept in order. And this Manus, first priest figure, is not a god, but it is a role that had to be fulfilled by someone. And very often it is this Odin character, which fulfills this wandering priest role that teaches about sacrifice and how it keeps the world in order. And that is really interesting as well. And I'll say that's really interesting because I can say something a bit controversial here now, which is that a lot of people called Odin the All-Father. Okay, so we have a number of books written, say, by Christians about Odin, and one of them is the Prose Edda. The Prose Edda was written by Snorri Sturluson, who was a Christian scholar in Iceland, with a lot of influence on the church, and he wrote this Prose Edda, which is lots of stories in prose form, so free text. About a story, really about Odin. He talks to the gods, and in there he keeps calling Odin the All-Father, or Father. He calls him so. F-O-D-I is how he spells it. Also through, and that's always been translated as All-Father. Okay, but actually that isn't how you spell father in Old Norse. So he isn't spelling father. He actually can be etymologically linked to the Old English. In order, to order. So rather than Odin being the All-Father, Odin could be, you translated it, I'd say properly, would be the All-Orderer, the someone so he's the orderer of the dead, the orderer of the slain, rather than the father of the slain, and that. So, and if you consider him the All-Orderer, that really links well with the Proto-Indo-European myth that Manus comes down and teaches people how to keep the world in order. That really links well. So, I believe the All-Father thing is not only bad translation, but that may have been an attempt by Snorri to link Odin to Jesus, maybe to say, oh, he's if you look at Odin like a Jesus character, that he is like the father to you look at, and that was used quite a lot throughout history by Christians. So what happened is, even though a king may want his country to be Christianized, he can't just snap his fingers and it happens. There has to be a process, a time that takes place.
Right.
So how people tended to accept that, and people like Bede Bede, you may know, in English history, wrote about. He actually talked about Woden in this form, and what you'll find is that many kings legitimized their kingship. Like if you went back 9 stages in their family tree, because 9's a lucky number, the ninth person back would have been Woden. So like Woden was their great grandfather, and the Christian church were happy with that because it allowed some legitimacy amongst the people that the king was from someone they knew, rather than worried about Christendom.
Right.
So I don't know how we got onto that, but that's how the sort of church used All-Father, and how Odin came up to not be a normal god, but was created at the time, this Manus figure. But then what also happens is, so you've got this Odin who's a priest figure, this Manus. You have the cult of Odin who comes from Mercury. But then you've got this other Odin figure that comes along, this Woden figure, and he comes along through something called the Wild Hunt. And the Wild Hunt is probably one of the oldest stories we know of, certainly told by Proto-Indo-Europeans and certainly told all over Europe. And the Wild Hunt is basically an event where lots of normally animals run across the sky at night and they're chased by a hunter. And that hunter initially seemed to start as a group of evil spirits. But over time and different stories, these group of evil spirits turned into animals, sometimes ravens, sometimes wolves, sometimes horses. And we've had examples of a man-eating horse or a half man, half horse. And eventually, over time, he was personified into a person riding a horse, and he was often known as Wode. So so Odin is an old Norse name for this god, but in Europe we called him Woden. So we have this Wode.
He's kind of Santa Claus. He's kind of the
Yep, absolutely. Now there's some old Norse scholars who would disagree with that.
Right.
But there are a lot that do agree with that. That he is that sort of figure, that old man figure. And if you think about old men, that is where he's coming from. So you've got these names of this priest, you've got these names of the Wild Hunt, you have this cult of Odin coming up, but then you also have, when you say he looks like or Santa Claus, the ferryman of the dead, as I say. So ferryman of the dead was an old man. That was how we understand him. He's actually Gerlon was his name in Greek, which means old man. But actually, there are old Norse stories of a ferryman appearing, and he's always talked as being, old bearded, grey bearded, and stuff like that. And again, and that's, to me, that's subtly hinting it's Odin in his psychopomp role as taking people to dead. But it's not only there; it's all over. Sort of the Indo-European landscape. This old ferryman appears, and he's quite interesting because he actually shows something else that happened in religion that a lot of people don't really understand or don't know about, which is that in the old Norse ferryman tales and in the Germanic ferryman tales, and even in the Greek and Roman ferryman tales, although Romans tend to copy the Greeks, so there's little value in them in terms of understanding new things, is that all those ferryman stories, the ferryman takes the dead person straight to the underworld or the land of the dead. There's no questions asked. In front of you can give me a coin, a noble or this coin. I'll take you across the river. Job's done. Very boring job, and that's why he looks old, haggard, and fed up with life. And his only excitement was when someone living came into the underworld saying, "Oh, take me to the underworld." That was the only excitement he got, and he got punished for helping that. Well, all those stories we hear are what we call from the centum division of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and that's a language difference. So everybody spoke one language, Proto-Indo-European, and then as they split up, language changed. And the very first splitting up of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, which was about 6,000 BCE, when they went east and west, some went to eastern Siberia, north of the Mongolian desert, some went west into Western Europe, so from Greece, Italy, Germany, and Scandinavia. All those stories of this first split, this centum split, the dead person goes straight to the underworld of the dead, no questions asked. But the next lot that spread out, the belief in that has changed, and there is a decision made on whether you've been good or not before you get to the underworld. So we can infer that between 6,000 BCE and probably 4,000 BCE, religion changed from believing that you just were dead to, oh no, something else happened after you died. That's saying nobody. I don't see much written about that, but you can clearly see it from the stories of how people went to the land of the dead. And what's interesting about that story, the land of the dead story, is that has been told, that the same story. So are you familiar with Orpheus? So Orpheus is a Greek.
Very little of Orpheus,
okay, so he's a poet, best poet in the world, apparently, according to the Greeks. Played his little harp. Everybody did whatever he wanted to do because he played beautifully. So he had a lover who died from a snake bite, goes to the underworld, and he wants to get his lover back. So he travels to the ferryman, gets excited, this living person. He plays his little lyre or whatever. He gets a free trip. And I think it's Hades who says, okay, you can have your, you play beautifully, you can have your lover back, but you, on one condition, you don't look back as you leave. Look back to see if she's following you as you leave. If you look back to see if she's following you as you leave, she will be pulled back into hell and you'll never see her again. So he goes, okay, great. So he walks out, and just before he leaves, he looks back to see if she's there. And there she goes, boom, gone. Okay. And he goes out and he's really sad, but he still plays good music. That story, told in Greece about 1000 BCE, is told in 43 different Native American people's tribes in North America. A man's lover dies, goes to the underworld. He goes to try and rescue her, has to fulfill something like a particular task. He fails at it. But when he leaves, he gets bitten by a snake bite and dies and has to go back to the underworld. And that's how he sees her again.
Interesting. I was going to say something that sounds not identical, but similar is the whole Lot and his wife. They're leaving. Don't look back. Exactly. She looks back. She turns into a pillar of salt. He loses his wife. Of course,
it's a reflex. Of the same, a derivative of that story. And so, but for North American tribes to know that, and European tribes to know that, that means that is Ice Age storytelling going on there. That's the only time the story could have gone. So that's a 15,000-year-old story you got right there. Which and that mythology gem has then carried on into sort of near modern day stories. That's how religion and culture and the people spread and get maintained. So
something to ask about in that 6,000 to 4,000 year range BCE, when religion changes or these myths change on the afterlife, did they then compartmentalize it somewhat like in Hades? There's kind of a location where it's not good, and then there's a good location to go to. Did that start happening?
I think it was if you went across the bridge or you went on the boat would sink. So sometimes there was a river to cross, like Shalon or Halon in the Greek, the ferryman there. His boat would sink. Oh, well, it would have sunk if you were bad. And that happened in the Vedic culture. They said if you had a bad priest performing the ritual of the dead, your boat would sink even. In the Zoroastrianism world, it had a very similar thing. If you were bad, the bridge would collapse or you'll fall off the bridge. So it wasn't that you went to a good place or a bad place. You were either good and you went there, but if you were bad, you wouldn't actually get there. So that's how it started to split before having a good place and a bad place, which would eventually turn up.
Egyptians, like the Egyptian, from what I understand, there's of course, there's the boat. They kind of have this underworld Nile that they have to traverse. However, if you're righteous, I can't remember exactly how it is, whether it was Horus or Cyrus, somebody helps guide you to your final destination. But if your heart, and they thought your heart was your mind, and they had an ancient way of looking at your body, the way that you, like we know the brain is the thought process. They thought it was the heart. They'd weigh your heart, and if it weighed more or whatever, then you wouldn't make it. It's kind of the same.
Absolutely, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, so there's all these multiple stories going on that were all then mashed up into the Odin we see today that gives him the character we see today. So long before, so Proto-Indo-Europeans didn't personify their gods. They were like spirits. They were often groups of spirits, but they were rarely a person they could focus on.
Right.
So that's how you got this Odin figure appear. So, and I know that there's many stories about Odin we can tell. As I say, he was always after knowledge, and being after knowledge, that's how he lost his eye. So he, so when the world of the gods was created and the realms were created, it was after there were good guys and bad guys. So they were the people called them the Aesir and the Vanir. So the Aesir were the good gods. And that links to, I think it's Asus of the Vedic and Asuha of Zoroastrian culture. They all have this sort of named, etymologically linked name for their gods. And they got the Vanir, the bad guys. They called them Jotuns, often thought of as giants, but they're not. They're just horrible people. This is probably a better way to call them. And there's a big fight. At the end, they sort of, we need peace. And so they they've taken prisoners in the war and exchanged prisoners. And one thing happens, I think there's a really clever person called Mimir, and who's been captured by the Vanir, and the Aesir want him back, and so they chop off Mimir's head and just send his head back. And because he's the cleverest person in the world, Odin preserves his head and keeps it with him, so he's always got Mimir's head to ask for knowledge. And then Mimir owned a well, a spring of water, which was considered the source of knowledge. If you drank from that, you would know everything. And so Odin went there, and he had to take it, and the giant who sort of was looking after that said, you have to take your eye out if you want to have a drink of the well. And so he said, I'll happily do that. So he moved his eye, threw it actually in the water, so he's always got that connection with this well of knowledge, and took a drink so he could understand everything. And that allowed him then to go to see a dead Volva, who's think of it as a witch, and he brought a witch up from the dead to say, you can prophesize. And she told him all, and her story about how the world was created allows us to understand what I'm telling you, these stories, because that's part of her story. And this is, but by the way, Ragnarok's coming. And so that's when he thinks, I know I'm going to die, because he says he's going to die in Ragnarok. And that's when he goes on his mission to then create Valhalla, I guess, and pull in the best dead soldiers. That's how that myth starts.
How old is that? Because just how old is the Valhalla idea? That
I would say it is no later than probably 200 CE, but in sort of mid first millennia, these things are probably starting to happen.
Do you have any idea about how early potentially? I mean,
no, you don't know. I mean, it can't really happen until Odin's been personified, and Odin wasn't really personified until, say, till the early part of the first millennia with the cult of Odin. That's when he really came. So I think it must have come with that. Those stories developed with that. So they're not ancient stories, those particular ones. But there is someone in Old Norse, a god called Othor. And Othor is etymologically linked to Odin. So Othor means poet. And Odin was considered a poet because Odin, he stole the mead of poetry. The mead of poetry is like soma, if you know familiar story with the Vedic, this special drink you drank and put your mind in a better state. Right. So this mead of poetry, funny enough, was made by Kvasir, who was made from when the gods had a war and they created peace. To create peace in those days, you spat into a bowl. Okay, so spitting is a belief or a ritual that people still do. Some people spit on the hand to shake hands to say it's all good. Yeah. So it's a sort of a development of that. So people all spat in a bowl, and because all the gods spat in a bowl, that spit they moulded into the most knowledgeable man ever, Kvasir. Okay, now the dwarves, who are sneaky little dwarves, they thought, we can't have this very clever man wandering around. What we do, we chop him up, mince him up, and turn his blood into a drink, the mead of poetry, which then, through various stories, ends up by being looked after by a giant's daughter. So she's got this barrel or two of mead of poetry with her.
And to ask about that mead real quick, what's in it? It's not just alcohol. This is probably some stuff that's going to make you see things and experience things, if I'm not mistaken. Isn't it soma,
possibly, yes. So there is a link to some mushroom being in that.
Right.
But equally, Old Norse, certainly Vikings, considered reading poetry, reading poetry and getting drunk as both ways of becoming ecstatic, is the words that's to use.
Okay.
So and we can talk, because poetry doesn't normally do that to people. Read poetry, you don't tend to get ecstatic, but we can talk about why that is, because their poetry is more than just poetry. There's a whole ritual behind many of the poems. So they were acted out. There was drama. It was like going to the movies when someone told you a poem. And that probably got you already excited, as well as this drink. So what happens when you leave a load of alcohol next to a beautiful woman? Odin turns up thinking, I need a bit of that mead. But while he was there, he also betrayed his wife and married this giant's daughter so he could sit in her golden throne for a few nights. make of that metaphor whatever you will. And then he escaped with all the mead of poetry. And he dropped a little bit through his bottom onto man, so they all had a little bit of knowledge, but he kept the rest for the gods. And
so guys have always been the same, is pretty much what you're saying.
Well, that's the Old Norse had no qualms about letting their brothers have their wives after they died in battle.
Right.
It's like, if I die in battle tomorrow, brother, you please marry my wife. And yeah.
Now, what if they already had wives? They didn't care about having multiple wives. What do you think?
Well, so Tacitus, so the historian who started talking about Deus Maximus to the Teutons at the first millennia, he actually made a really specific point about how some people in the Germanic tribes were very monogamous in terms of relationships. They stayed with one person all the time, and he thought that was very unusual.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that wasn't slightly different in the Scandinavian countries. I mean, men are men, so. And back then, they didn't have some of the constraints that men have today. Yeah, there isn't. There was no law, helping restrict what they did. So, yeah, who knows? But I'd imagine there was still, a certain amount of respect if you were monogamous and stayed with one woman, or certainly the men didn't want to divorce their wives. Didn't mean they didn't want to go elsewhere, but they would still try to keep that relationship going. That's how I would guess. And so what was I going? So Kvasir, mead of poetry, Odin gets it, comes clever, and works out. And that's how he knew, by drinking the mead of poetry, he became even more clever to work out how to get this Volva to tell him that there's Ragnarok and create all this. So it's an incredibly complex story to create this one god. But because he's got this mead of poetry and there's this god Othor, which means poet, many people think, Odin is Othor. Okay, so that's interesting because Snorri Sturluson, who wrote the Prose Edda, where some of these stories come from, actually does his best to try and keep these two gods apart, as though they're different. But then you get other academics. I know Jackson Crawford on his channel, he did a video a month or so ago saying all Odin is Othor plus in. In means the. So Othor, poet, goes to Odin, the poet. And the problem with that is that in the part of the myths where Odin creates man, because Odin is the priest figure that has come down in the Proto-European myth, and as a priest figure he creates man. In that, there are three gods that create man and woman out of two logs. Okay, there's Odin, Honir, and Lothor. And Odin gives a gift of Ond, which I'll talk about in a minute. And Ond is a breath, or is often translated as breath. You have Lothor, who gives Litogotha, which means colour. And you have Honir, who gives Othor, which we consider poetry. So we have to ask ourselves, why is Lothor giving Othor, which means poetry, when you've got Odin there? Surely Odin would give Othor. And so that makes many academics think, well, actually, no, Odin can't be Othor plus in. And what it seems to have happened is that Ond, Othor given Ond, that Ond is actually means movement rather than breath. So breath is like wind. And because Woden comes from Wode, which is the wild hunt, and frenzied movement and chaotic, which is what Odin was, that we believe that Ond actually means movement, and that would make sense, and that would link Odin to the wild hunt and to the Wode, and then you start to see these different ideas start to join together, and that's why that happened. So so that's how we believe Othor, who would probably, although it means poetry, is probably actually also a derivative of the wild hunt myth coming up into Scandinavia, joined almost the wild hunt myth which came from Woden, coming up from Germania and merging into this one character. So far more different than the Marvel Odin than you're aware of. Oh, you've got mute, Derek. You've muted.
These were the three, so to speak, people at creation, or gods that were at creation, right? Creating man.
There was so in the old Norse creation myth, you have Ymir, which is cognate to the Ymo, or the Proto-Indo-European meaning twin. you have, and a giant cow, and that's it. And the giant cow licks some ice to create Bor, who was the first Asir sort of god, and Ymir rubs his legs together and he creates Jotun from his rubbing his legs, and they just come out of his body because he's an androgyny. Because he's a twin god, he's man and woman, and so can create. So you have all these Jotuns and you have Bor, and what happens is they get together and then create the gods. So going back to Odin being the All-Father, in the Old Norse myth, Bor could be argued as the All-Father because Bor was the father of Odin. But Odin did father an awful lot of gods. But that's it. But Odin and his two brothers, Vili and Vi, are often considered in the Prose Edda by Snorri, the three gods who come to Earth to create man. But in the Poetic Edda, which is written 50 years later, but could often refer to texts written initially a lot earlier, and that's a list of Old Norse poetry, which is very important to the Old Norse. In there, it says it's Odin, Lothor, and Hunir as the three gods, and they're not brothers. But we don't really know so much about Hunir and Lothor.
So let me ask you this: we brought up Odin.
Mm-hmm.
Odin, Othor, the various forms of this. Where does Thor connect to Odin? Like, what is Thor's role in this? And then, who the hell is this guy with this hammer? You know, like, what? Obviously, this god. Let me not even say guy. Who? How does he connect to Odin? And then, what's up with this character?
Okay, so that's a great question, because if we go back to the creation myth of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, there is the priest figure who comes down to Earth, this Manus, but also a king is created. So they have this king figure or priest, and they're sometimes the same, this sovereign figure. But then there's also a warrior figure. This warrior figure can seen in Vedic culture as Indra, but is also the god that would eventually become Thor. And this warrior figure, you often initially see killing dragons, and we can go back to what that actually really is, because that isn't killing dragons. And Thor, this Thor warrior figure, is often associated with a god, because what happens, cows are very important, is God creates a cow, that gives it to man. Man should eat the cow and sacrifice some of it back to the god to say thank you, and then the god gives you more cows. But then what happens is that some enemy comes along and steals the cows. So what happens now is that God gives the cow, enemy comes along, steals the cow, the warrior goes and collects the cow, but he has to sacrifice to the gods to get himself the strength to win victory in getting the cow before he sacrifices back to the god. And there's this circle of life with this cow. And what is interesting about that is that this sacrifice to the god, there's this warrior sacrifice to the god, gets merged into one. So normally there's a mortal sacrificing to Indra, say in Vedic, but this goes on in to Germanic stories. We haven't got whole stories, but there's pictures and things like an iconography which sort of reflects some of this. What we see is this warrior is actually called Trito initially, and this Trito is interesting because Trito means third. So you have the first man Manus, the twin god Yemo, and the third, this warrior third, Trito. So you see this 1, 2, 3 concept going on in Proto-Indo-European mythology to create that structure. So, and you see what happens is then that this Trito warrior gets combined with this sky god, and in some religions the sky god splits into a sky god and a storm god with thunder and lightning, and that storm god, if not the sky god, is merged with the warrior to become this warrior storm god.
Right, when he sacrifices, they merge.
Yeah. So part of that sacrificial ritual. Over time, that story developed as one, and in fact, I can show you that. So, Thor, you may have heard the story of Thor and the Midgard serpents, Jotungamma, when Thor goes out and tries to catch this big world serpent that stretches around the world. Okay, so the actual story of that is quite interesting. So Thor decides to go on a little adventure, because Thor does. I mean, the one thing the Marvel movies gets right is that Thor isn't the most cleverest of on the ball of guys. So he goes on a little adventure, but he's dressed as a boy. So here the storm god is also now a mortal. So he looks like a mortal boy and being a god. So you've got both characters as one. And he goes out and bumps into a giant's house. And he likes giants' houses because he is the killer of giants. He's Thor. He loves killing giants. Let's go to this giant's house. And hospitality is key in the culture of the Old Norse. So the giant, thinking that Thor's a boy and not Thor, the guy who wants to kill him because he's a giant killer, invites him in. And he says, "Oh, what do you want for dinner?" And he goes, "Oh, I'll have 2 cattle, please." So he eats 2 cattle. Giant's not particularly happy. Bit annoyed. You've eaten all our food, Thor. Not happy. I'm going to have to go fishing tomorrow. Okay, so the morning comes. Thor says, "Can I go fishing with you?" And the giant says, "Well, no, I'm just going out into the sea. You don't have to." So, "No, I don't mind. I'll go out with you." It says, the giant goes, "Okay, get yourself some bait." So Thor goes into a field and rips the head off the giant's best cattle. Boom, it takes the head of cattle, goes into the rowing boat, and he rows. And now, because Thor is rowing, the giant says, "Oh, please stop just here. This is where I'll go fishing." But Thor carries on rowing and rowing and rowing. And the giant gets, "No, you're going too far. You're going too far." And that's actually representative of the Proto-European myth where people steal the cattle, that they're going to a different land to where the other cattle is. Then Thor puts the bull's head on a hook, throws it overboard, catches the Midgard serpent, pulls it up. So he's catching the cattle. You can see it because it's a reflex of. And he whacks the Midgard serpent with his hammer. At some point in the story, the giant releases the catch. Cat's along because he's scared of sinking. Thor punches the giant. Giant falls overboard, and Thor sort of goes off, kills a few more Jotuns, and the cat. So he continues. But what you have there is again another of a derivative story of this cattle raiding myth. This the rescuing a dragon, or beating a dragon to get to the princess type myth, which is what that turned into. Which is Thor is both the god and the boy. You see him have a fight over cattle, like bashing the dragon over the cow's head, and gets success and manages to go home. So and that's how these stories develop and change through time. So yeah, so that's just one example of the story of Thor. But how Thor actually came to be proper is quite interesting, because Thor, as I said, what his name means, thunder and lightning, and then his hammer means lightning. He isn't actually a storm god proper. He's a sky god. And what happened is that certainly in the European side of mythology, the first storm god we're aware of is Perun or Perkinus. It changed into from the Baltic and Slavic states, and that was a sort of a storm god, and it very similarly had a goat-led chariot, much like Thor. So if you're not familiar, Thor this chariot with goats, and these goats were very special. That if he could eat them or if they died, they'd regenerate the next day. So that's quite useful. And the reason we think that's the case is because within Scandinavia there is a bird called the snipe. And the snipe, when it flies overhead, it sounds like a baby goat bleating. And they think, they may have said, "Oh, look, there's Thor and his chariot going overhead." But that's how these sort of things happen. So Perkinus and Perun, as that language and those beliefs moved into Europe, the language changed a bit. And Perkinus means, I think it's like oak, striking an oak tree. So there's a lot of view about oak trees getting being really good to burn, for getting far from within the tree, and stuff like that. And that name changed over time. I'm just trying to think where it changed it. So it's into Fjordgen eventually, which means sort of a mountain forest. And Fjordgen is actually, and it turned into Tanalis, I believe, in the Celtic down towards Spain. But Fjordgen is actually the cognate to the original storm god's name, and that appeared in Britain, and it appears as in a couple of different types of gods within the Old Norse pantheon. So what happened is Fjordgen obviously isn't the storm god, because everybody's associating that with Thor, and so there was a shift in the Old Norse pantheon, and I've never heard a good explanation of how this shift happened, but initially Tyr was probably the head of the Germanic pantheon, the Old Norse pantheon. And I'll say that because Tyr is cognate with Zeus or Jupiter, because the very first sky god was Deus Putter, and Deus Putter becomes Zeus, and becomes Jupiter. But that also turns into Tiwaz, which goes to Tyr. And Tyr just means God. Okay. Now, Tyr gets removed from the head of the pantheon at some point in the Old Norse and gets replaced with Freyja. And Freyja from the Germanic means Lord. So, in effect, you're changing it like someone just called God to someone we know as Lord. But by moving Tyr, who was the natural sky god, you've now got a gap of that, because Freyja is all about the god of how can I explain love? Let's say calling the god of fertility. That's the word I'm looking for. The god of fertility. But we don't have a sky god, so they need a sky god there. And so they create a Thor, and this is done in Germanic because we've got different names for like Donor and Thunor in Germanic and Anglo-Saxon, turning into Thor of the Scandinavian to give that sky god place there. And then we get Odin coming along, filling in the third spot. Because they have this priest figure. And so to me, that's how the Thor came along, because Tyr was removed, probably from the whole Germanic belief system for some reason. I can't understand why. Replaced with Freyja, and Freyja could easily become the chief god on the number of the cultures into Germanic tribes. But yeah, you had this gap, and Thor fills in. So that's how he came to be. However, the whole concept of having a storm god with a hammer is very, very, very old. Far. I don't know, because we have iconography, so paintings of men with hammers and axes and maces going back to maybe 2000 BCE, maybe even 3000 BCE, and that's all around. So it's important to have this, this image. And I say we know Zeus is old and Jupiter's old, and they all come from the same initial god. And this was a Proto-Indo-European god. So where Odin is a Proto-Indo-European belief of Manus coupled with wild hunt, Thor actually has come from a sky god, storm god background of the Proto-Indo-European pantheon, and then has come up. So two very different gods created in different ways, standing together.
Thor seems, and the way that you kind of taken us through this path, because it's not like all the research that I start doing, like there's not a simple, easy, straightforward path to anything. When you start studying stuff deeply, you realize, okay, there's some complexity. This, especially being this stuff usually is an organic development from the ground up, if you will, naturally happening over time. These evolve. But what did pique my interest was there's this man who's sacrificing to a god, somehow becomes fused with the god. This idea, there's so many parallels, if it can use the term, and I don't mean it in the literal copy and paste sense, but it sounds like the whole world and all religions, people have very similar motifs. And here you have this strange eating of the flesh, drinking of the blood, rituals that connect you with the gods. They take on different forms. So, obviously Christianity is not saying, look, sacrifice a goat, sacrifice a cow, and you're going to connect to the divine. They have a communal, ritual. However, there are other.
But that communion is blood and flesh, and don't get me wrong. So the Proto-Indo-Europeans probably initially sacrificed cattle, and they did, and horses. But over time, that will change to just give blood, or just give milk, or just give mead. So as humans had more need for those resources, they sacrificed less and less to the gods, because they couldn't afford. Well, yes, they couldn't afford to, but there's obviously things going on, on how we make those judgments. But I totally agree. I mean, so I've done a video about Genesis, and I can show that Genesis is the Proto-Indo-European creation myth. Just tweak the first sort of two chapters or first chapter. So it does. So certainly the Indo-European religions, those across the landscape, are pretty much all linked to the Proto-Indo-European.
Interesting. Oh gosh, I was just thinking about that because Genesis uses the Apkallu narrative from the Mesopotamians, and the Apkallu, there's 7 sages that come down. This sounds very much like one of the gods you were defining, or that was teaching. Well, first of all, you see they have axes, they have hammers, things like this, agriculture, Like they're teaching the sciences, the arts to mankind in the Mesopotamian myth. And the difference, of course, if you look at that one, is the gods don't want to labor anymore, so they have man working, and then the men won't shut up. So humans just are so loud and obnoxious, they send a flood. In the Genesis, it's they're wicked. Do you think the Genesis? This is something to ask, interesting, because Genesis, this development of giants doesn't require you to have to think these are humans necessarily, but do you think, because it sounded like in the Proto-Indo-European one, these are really bad humans, or are they like extremely powerful bad humans, or what is a giant? Why are we looking at giants in Genesis 6 and in the Mesopotamian myths? We know Enoch takes this and runs and says, oh, there's this 360-foot giant and blah, blah, blah. My fridge is beeping. Hold on one second. I can hear you, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay, so there's two bad people we can look at the Proto-Indo-European bad people. So when they had to get the cows back from the enemy, they had this Trito, and Trito was always fighting this three-headed dragon. The dragon was always three-headed, and it appeared like that in myths. And what seems to be the case is that around the time of the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the Indo-Mediterranean cultures, they worshipped a three-headed god. There wasn't a three-headed god in the Proto-Indo-European pantheon, because you don't have the three-headed god sort of here, certainly in the European religions. And to me, that three-headed god turned into that three-headed serpent. So all it really is doing for the enemy of the Proto-Indo-Europeans is that they're fighting, in effect, a representation of the gods of their enemy, but in a dragon form. And a dragon is often considered the human's chaotic thoughts or something bad. So that's how that's applied. The Jotun on the Old Norse side, so the Vanir, that is far more interesting. So because we have contradictory texts. We have texts that suggest that Vanir and Dasir are different, but we have texts that suggest they're the same. So and also you have to bear in mind that there's a lot of poetry going on, and sometimes and poetry in Old Norse is about alliteration, a lot about alliteration. So the first letter has to remain constant rather than it rhyme. So, the things that alliterate with the seer are very different to things that alliterate with Vanir. So it may be that, Vanir was created to, in effect, give options for alliteration about gods. And it's just over time, so we just associated Jotun with bad gods, rather than because the gods quite happily, Odin slept with loads of Vanir, loads of the bad gods. In fact, old gods did. Everybody slept with each other. It was a I wouldn't say a free for all, but there was a lot of. You're muted again, Derek. You're muted.
Oh man, why do I do that every time? I said, whatever happened to that religion? Why aren't we? That was the fun stuff. Now we got all like boring and crap.
Well, yes, that's the Christians coming along and basically said, if you don't like Christianity, we're going to kill you and destroy your village. So there's a whole heap of genocide going. Seriously, in Europe, Christians commit a whole heap of genocide, and you don't hear anything really about it. It was frightening for the people at the time.
Did you have a question, though? I want to ask. Okay. Susan Brewer asks, she's brought it up multiple times, the Trinity concept. Something's up with this, right? I do see a lot of threes, and is it parallelomania in my head that's going, okay, we have like kind of a Trinity type concept in the Indian, if you will, pantheons. They obviously are polytheist, but from what I've spoke to a couple of people who are practices of the Vedic traditions, they say, yeah, we have a Trinity type concept. This three-headed deity, am I reaching way outside? Because what I noticed, the more I study, let's put it this way for everybody watching, and it's a great question, Susan, but the more I study, John, the more I realize how extremely complex every individual particular worldview religion is, and it doesn't necessitate genetic connection or mimesis or something like that. A lot of times three may be a common thing. It just is in cultures all across the world. But do you think there's something connected here based on your research?
If I put my psychological hat on rather than my historical hat, because I have one of those, I think it is psychological. There is something, we feel comfortable with a 1, 2, 3 rhythm in many things, in stories, in getting your point across, in how things are. And the triangle is a naturally strong shape. It's probably the strongest two-dimensional shape we have. You can't twist it or anything. So to me, 3 is just it's a natural human belief to associate something with 3 because it just feels right. Which may seem like a cop-out kind of answer, but it just does. I mean, the old Norse, 9 was the number for them. Everything was like Woden was 9 steps back. There were 9 realms. Things are 9 heads. There were 9 wives. 9 appears a lot, but for the general 3 and the Trito, Trito just became because you had Manus and Ymo and Trito 1, 2, 3. But I think that's just the way human mind works. As you say, you're not genetically linked. There's just a natural disposition to think that 3 is a really useful way to get a point across. You're saying something, but not too much.
Okay, we're gonna talk about one more character, and before we do, be sure go subscribe to his channel, guys. Let's help him grow. This content, he's gonna do more content on like what can we glean in parallels between like Thor or Odin or whoever and Jesus or biblical characters and stuff, even if there aren't any supposed parallels that people point out. He's going to start like dissecting things like that in the future. I don't know when. I'm not going to put that on him. That's when you have the time, John, of course. But please go subscribe to his channel, because this information, I really, really love getting into various different thoughts, and different kinds of religions, because it really makes me question, like, how can I say I had the right one, right? And I think any Christian, if they're going to be honest, should go. They can't. I know, because I was there, and I know how your experience automatically assumes the bias of I'm correct and everyone's wrong. But if you really just looked at yourself and your own thing and then said, look at this world of other ideas, like, you feel, instead of being so big, you start getting really little and realize, okay, hold on, there's a world of religions prior to mine, and peoples for a long time that have been trying to understand the world we live in, why we live, why we die, why are we here? And they put in these stories exactly why and what's the meaning behind things. So that being said, we hear about a sneaky guy named Satan. Okay. Satan is sometimes by Christians referred to as the serpent, right? And they refer to it back in the garden because, well, the heel of the woman will crush the serpent's head. And in the book of Revelation, it talks about the serpent. The serpent tricked the humans, right? In a sense, is like, you won't die. But we've watched the recent Thor movies, okay? And he has a brother. And this brother's name is Loki, right? This is very broad stroke. This is so Hollywood. But can you tell us who Loki is? What's his relationship with Thor in the myths? Or maybe even Odin? Like, what is going on with this guy?
That's good. And what I'll also say about the religious stuff before I do this is that if you actually really look into it, it actually makes you feel a lot better about humanity if you look deeper into religion. And we can touch on that towards the end of our chat, because it's quite amazing. But Loki, really interesting. So first off, Loki is not Thor's brother. Okay, so let's get that out of the way. But he is a blood brother of Odin.
Ooh.
And as part of that deal, Odin also swore he'd never eat again. So he now only drinks. So Odin only drinks alcohol to sustain himself. So it's quite a lifestyle he has.
Now
not
I know why my dad was drinking all those years. You know what I mean?
So, but Loki and Thor tended to be a lot in partnership. So Loki tended to get things in trouble, and Thor came along to sort of fix them. But there's normally some kind of almost comedic thing about it. So, for example, once Thor's hammer was stolen, and Loki seemed to know exactly who stole it, and to get it back, basically it was stolen by Jotuns, these monstrous beings, and they said, "Oh no, we'd have to marry Freyja who's the most beautiful woman, and I'll give you the hammer back. But what happens is that Thor dresses as a bridesmaid. No, Thor dresses as a bride, and Loki dresses as a bridesmaid, and they go along. So Thor tries to pretend he's Freyja. So there they are at this wedding feast.
You mean Loki? Loki tried.
Loki's a bridesmaid.
Okay.
Thor's the bride, and so they go along to the Jotun to get, because basically, Thor often threatens Loki, if you don't help me, I'm going to smash your head in. So Loki feels he has to help. So there they are at this wedding feast, and this Jotun's feeling a bit confused because his bride to be, Freyja, the lovely Freyja, has just eaten like 8 oxen and drunk 15 barrels of beer, and it isn't the kind of woman he was expecting to be marrying. Anyway, as part of the marriage ceremony, I think Thor's sitting on his lap or something. Or Thor's sitting down, and as a wedding gift, the Jotun gives Mjolnir, like the hammer, Thor's hammer, to his bride, who's Thor, and says, like, this is my gift to you for us to get married. He goes, thank you, and then picks up the hammer and kills everyone. And off they go home. But it's just a weird story. But there's actually a story that involves Loki and Thor about how Thor got his hammer, which you may not be aware of. So Thor was married to Sif, a beautiful woman with long golden hair. And for a laugh, as you do, one night, Loki decides to cut all of her hair off. If you've got a god friend who can kill you, why don't you cut all his wife's hair off as a laugh? So does this. Thor wakes up, immediately thinks, Loki, what have you done? He goes, oh, really sorry. He says, you better fix this or I'm going to smash your head in. And that's how it works. So Loki thinks, how am I going to fix this? How am I going to get some golden hair for Thor's wife? So he actually goes off to the dwarves, who are very skilled at making things. And he's got no money, he's got no resources, but he needs them to make hair. So he says, I'm going to do you a deal. I'm going to pit your one set of dwarves off with another set of dwarves to make the best gifts ever for a god. And if you could make some golden hair with that, that would be really cool. And whoever makes it, gets the god's favor. And one set of dwarves actually says, well, we need a bit more than that, Loki. Actually, what we're going to do is, if we win, if we produce the best things, we're going to take your head off. Okay. And Loki has to agree because he needs these things. So what happens is, as the dwarves are making these gifts, Loki turns into a fly and keeps stinging the dwarves as they're making and blowing bellows and furnishing things so to put them off. And he only succeeds once, and that was when they're making a hammer, Mjolnir. And what happened, because Thor stung one of the dwarves in the eye as he was making Mjolnir. Sorry?
Loki, you mean?
Loki turned into a fly,
right,
lands on the eye of a dwarf, stings the eye, makes the dwarf not do his thing exactly right, and Mjolnir comes out, but it comes out with a short handle. So that's why Mjolnir has a short handle rather than a long sledgehammer type thing. So because of that. Anyway, so these gifts are created. There's a ship that is so light it could be folded up into your pocket. There's a board that can run as fast as anything through water and air. There's gifts, and it's got Mjolnir, Gungnir, Odin's spear that always hits its target. It's there, and some long golden hair. But basically, the dwarves who wanted Loki's head won the competition, and all the gods are really happy with their gifts. But the dwarves come in and say, sorry, I need Loki's head now. And Loki, being cunning, says, but to have my head, you've got to cut my neck. And that wasn't part of the deal. You can't touch my neck. And the gods thought about it for a while, thought, he is right, dwarves, but you can do what you want with his head. And so they sewed his mouth shut so he couldn't ever talk again. And so that's how Mjolnir came to be, Odin's spear came to be, and Loki got some comeuppance.
Do you think these were like campfire songs or stories? Like what, it's obviously we get a chuckle out of it, but it's like, it's silly. You know what I mean? Like in reality, we would look at this and go, yeah, this is definite, just fake, not real. Were these, what do you think? How do you think these were taken? Like, how did they religiously look at these stories?
I mean, I think there is a lot of ritual about this. So these poems were never written down in the Old Norse. They were written down by Christians after, but at the time, everything was told, through all transmission, much like Celtic and things like that, which is why we have very little understanding of what's going on there. And So because there's this oral tradition, this was associated with a ritual. We can really understand that around things like other stories like the Hávamál and the Grimnismal, which are Odin focused things. But I'm pretty sure this would have been played out, as a play, for people to watch. And as a side, a little side bit of interesting trivia for you, for Marvel fans, in Dogma, if you're familiar with the Dogma series of films by Kevin, I've forgotten his surname, director, Matt Damon plays Loki, sort of in 1990, long before Marvel comes along.
Oh, wow.
But in the Marvel films of Thor, where Loki takes over Odin because he's got rid of Odin, and he's watching a play about Thor and Loki's dying on the floor, and Thor's crying, and Loki, who's now Odin, is watching. That Loki on the floor is Matt Damon again, playing Loki. So Matt Damon, who played Loki, is now playing someone who's playing Loki in the Marvel film, just as a bit of sort of trivia, Easter egg trivia for you.
Wow.
So there's that. So, but the Loki came to a sort of a slightly sticky, a near sticky end. So he was eventually tied up. So let's get this right. Loki can also change shape and change. He changes to a fly. Have you ever heard of Odin's horse Sleipnir with 8 legs? So Odin's got a horse, Sleipnir, and he's got 8 legs, and it runs really fast, obviously, with 8 legs. Right. Where did such a horse come from? Well, you got to thank Loki for that, who gave birth to it while he was a horse. But he also
slept with some crazy ass beast or something.
There's some weird stuff going on. Well, he gave birth to the Midgard serpent as well. That's Loki, and Loki.
He gave birth, or someone else?
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I know. And Fenrir as well as his child. And Fenrir is the wolf that consumes Odin at the Ragnarok.
I actually remember that in the game. So some of the cool thing about some of these games, that the game I told you about that I was getting, the last version of Assassin's Creed.
Yes.
Yeah, he has a kid, but I thought he slept with some blue giant lady or something like that to have the wolf, from what I understood when I went to I had to go to another realm.
I'll have to check the detail on that. But yes, he's certainly he's certainly a parent of the wolf, definitely. Well, he's his son. Ben is his son. But he gets revenge because at Ragnarok they'll come along and kill all the giants. But yeah, he is tied up and poison is dripping on his head for a long time just before Ragnarok happens. So he does get some comeuppance. But that really doesn't explain where Loki comes from. And you also think he's a sneaky god, where there are stories of Loki where he is a benevolent god. He's a good god. So on the Faroe Islands, which are some islands between Scotland and Denmark, owned by Denmark, there are a load of tales. And one of those tales, called Loki's tale, tells of how a farmer plays a game with a giant and loses, and the giant wins the farmer's son as a prize. And the farmer doesn't want the giant to have his son because the giant's probably going to eat him. So he calls on the gods to help. And Odin comes along, that tries to hide him, doesn't work. Honir comes along, tries to hide him, doesn't work. Then Loki comes back and he manages to not only hide his son a bit, but also sets up a trap which kills the giant. And Loki becomes the good guy. He saves the farmer's son, kills the giant, and life is good. So there are these other stories floating around different parts of the Scandinavian world where Loki isn't bad. And in fact, in the Germanic world, or the Saxon world, if you call it, Loki doesn't exist. There is no Loki in the Germanic worlds.
Interesting.
So Loki is pretty much a Scandinavian creation. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. We got a question here. Ben is kind of a Loki. He's a trickster with this question. No, I'm just kidding. He's super clever. He's always been watching. Thanks for the super chat, Ben. I appreciate it. Okay. It helps us keep the lights on here. Any thoughts on if Odin's crucifixion story has pre-Christian origins or if it's an intentional parallel?
Brilliant question, Ben. I like that. That's so what we're talking about there is Odin hanging from a tree. So there is a poem called the Hávamál, which is sort of Odin's wise words. It's like a book of Proverbs, pretty much. And in that is some great advice. But towards the end, it talks about how Odin hung from a tree for 9 nights. He gave himself, sacrificed himself to himself, stabbed himself with a spear, and there he saw the runes and he grabbed the runes. Now that's interesting for a number of things. So, hanging was a form of sacrifice. So if you wanted to sacrifice someone, you would hang them, and there were a number of kings actually hung in the early Middle Ages, in effect, similar to this. Yeah. So it was a common thing. Now, people like to think it sounds very Christian, but actually, the general academic view at the moment is that it has no links to Christianity whatsoever. Or even particularly shamanistic views, apart from the fact that it's talking about Odin getting the runes. And my interpretation of this is that this is more about how Odin grabbed magic through the use of the mead of poetry. I don't know if you heard it earlier, Ben. We were talking about the mead of poetry and how it can get you into a different mindset. And here, by Odin hanging, he's performing a ritual. He's starving himself. He's not drinking. By starving and not drinking, your mind will go a bit doolally, especially with then drinking mead of poetry, and you see things, and that's how he saw this mead. So he isn't actually performing a "I'm dying and coming back from the dead" ritual here. He's actually performing an ancient ritual to grab magic, because runes. I mean, the term rune means like esoteric writings, secret knowledge, and that's what he's sort of grabbing, so he can have the power of magic, which allows him on his quest to not die at Ragnarok. Obviously, it didn't work, but that's what that's about. So whilst it seems like there are some parallels because of the spear and because of the hanging, actually that hanging was just a common way of sacrifice, with a spear to just rub it in, really, to help finish it. That was just a common motif of how you would kill someone who's hanging. So,
interesting. So the other, I guess some scholars, since you said some scholars, most scholars will probably agree with what you just said, but there are some scholars, you say, that will say, yeah, this probably has Christian influence.
Yes, because Odin was post-Christianity. So whilst he wasn't post-Christian conversion, what was happening is you were finding on the rise. So when the Rome became a republic, so before it became an empire, sort of towards the end of the 1st century BCE, it was a republic, and that's when it was starting to build up its power, and it needed armies, and it needed resources for those armies, and it got them from neighbouring countries. So some of those included Scandinavian peoples, and we know this because we can see Roman coins and other artifacts in Scandinavia dated from that period. And so it suggests that some peoples came down and fought for the Roman armies, and by fighting for the Roman armies, there is obviously, stories are told across cultures then at that point, because you've got many cultures in one place, and that's how things spread. That's how you get the Mithras type religions crop up, or you get Tyr crop up on Hadrian's Wall in Scotland, and things like that. So yeah, so that's all. What to me, that's what happened. So there is some influence, without doubt, from Rome pushing up, because you've got the cult of Odin and the Mercury, as I've said, and the other things. So that allows sort of these stories to change and develop, and Christianity possibly then cropped up. So that must have happened like once Rome was an empire, but that influence, I would have thought, pushed up, because Christianity, when did it hit Rome proper? 200 AD, was it? 200 CE, about then, I think.
Roman Empire?
Well, no, Christianity arrived in Rome
as a serious religion, I would say going 2nd, 3rd century.
Exactly. So yeah, 200 to 300. See, and that sort of coincides well with the time I talked about the cult of Odin, developing. So Christianity was known. So there may have been some influence there, doing that. So yeah.
Interesting. I'm trying to see if there were any other questions up here that people had wrote that were really wanting to have them answered before we go. But if you have any questions, you can always super chat it or just write your questions out. I'll try and read it. I was going to ask you, before we do let you go, where should they start if they really want to learn some of this stuff? What's a good book that's not too far into the weeds, but it'll get people like a really good topical understanding on the subject of Odin, Thor, maybe going into the Proto-European stuff. Because there's like, fair warning for a lot of people who might be watching this, there is a lot of white supremacy tendencies in this subject matter, because just like people want to do with the lost tribes of Israel that I constantly research on now, you know, oh, we're the chosen race of people and such. And that happens often with this particular research that you're talking about. So what are some safe areas to go into this without getting caught up in...
Okay. There are lots of safe areas. So, yeah, well, whilst you say there are bits like that, there's much safe places. So, the prose Edda and the poetic Edda are good books to start off with. You have Jackson Crawford's prose Edda. That's very contemporary English, but he does calm down the writing a bit, so you don't necessarily get the blood and guts of a different translation prose Edda. If you wanted a more academic poetic Edda, I mean academic one, Caroline Larrington's. So those two poetic Eddas, Crawford's or Larrington's, are good. I've got a video on those on my site if you want to choose to. The prose Edda, which is sort of freeform text from Snorri Sturluson, that's also worth reading. Interestingly, in that there is a story about Loki and Thor in there, where they have to do a number of tasks, okay, and they fail at those tasks. And actually, what academics now believe is that that myth was, or that story was written by Snorri, or made up by Snorri, as a conversion tool. So he's thrown in there a tool to show that, the gods are fallible and only human, because that wouldn't normally be a story that people would tell. So whilst the prose Edda has lots of good stuff in it, there's also an element of Christian bias on it. But they're really the places to start if you want to read stories about those gods. If you want to read stories about the Proto-Indo-Europeans, there's a couple of, probably a good book actually is Prouvel's Comparative Mythology. That's actually quite cheap. It's about $30, imagine $40, but that tells you all the different religions in sort of the Indo-European landscape and sort of tells you how they compare. And that's a good place to start. And then if you read a book like that, they often have bibliographies at the back and references of where that information came from. And so you just start, if you see something you like and you say, that's referenced in a different book, then you dive into those books. But those books, like some of the ones behind me, it can be hundreds of dollars each and really difficult to get hold of. I mean, I actually have a PO box in the States because it's cheaper for me to buy some books in the States, ship them to a PO box in the States, bash them together in one postage package, then send it to me in the UK, because they are just so expensive otherwise.
Wow. Okay. Question. When we brought up Loki being the father of, or the mother, or the whatever of the wolf, is this because in the game, that game that I was telling you when we were writing, I was like, dude, you got to play it. The graphics are great.
Yeah.
It's actually a really cool game. You're in, where's the place where the gods hang out at? Is it not Olympus, is it? No, Olympus is the Greek one.
What, you mean their realm?
The realm, yeah. What's it called?
They're in Asgard.
Asgard, yes. So they're in Asgard. These giant blue monster people, gods, whatever, are coming in trying to attack.
Very Marvel.
Wolf gets in. The wolf grows and never stops growing. So you restrain the wolf. But you find out when you almost kill it, Loki comes, is like crying, begging you, please stop. Of course, it's a video game, but he's like, stop, that's my child. And you find out after some crap happens that it's this blue giant lady that Loki hooked up with or something. But I don't know how accurate that is, which is why I was asking you that Loki's giving birth. So
Jackson Crawford, who I mentioned, who wrote the Poetic Edda translation, he actually did consultancy on that video game. So there will be an element of good myth in there. There's obviously an element of Marvelness to it, but there is definitely he's done a good job on that. So
wow.
As for the mother of Fenrir, I have to say I don't know off the top of my head, because I don't remember some of the stories in that detail, because my expertise is as Proto-Indo-European as much as Old Norse, so I don't get that. But it'd be easy to Google that to find out.
Well, John, any final words you'd like to let everybody know? Hold on. We got a super chat. Crash the party. And everyone, this is my friend Nate. Go subscribe to his channel. Please, let's help him get over 100 subscribers. He's got a really big interview coming up. So please do John, with all the interesting stories from Greek and Norse culture, do you have a favorite?
Ooh, I do like the dragon fighting myth as a whole because of how many things it's turned into. So, as I said, the tree turned the dragon. So, God gives cows, someone steals a cow, Trito rescues the cow, sacrifices God. But what's happened over time is the cows turn into princesses and the enemy have turned into dragon. And that's how you get the dragon fighting myths. And that's exactly why, like, the fighting of Tiamat isn't a dragon fighting myth, it's a creation myth. Because you're creating the world from the body of Tiamat. And yeah, so there are subtle differences there. But I really like that whole concept. But perhaps what I really enjoy is the stories behind the stories. So let's finish on this, which will say give you hope about the human race. So before the Proto-Indo-Europeans at that time, there were no cities. We were all hunter-gatherers. Before 10,000 BCE, we were pretty much wandering around. But there are stories that were told in Indo-Europeans and in North America. We have some like the Cosmic Hunt. We have the Orpheus myth. So you've got to ask yourself, if we're not, as humans, wandering around, how do we all know the same story? Because, there isn't a central place you all go to tell it. There wasn't a city or anything. And so there must have been a natural proclivity for human strangers to want, if they saw other strangers, to talk and to meet and to share stories. And that's how the stories changed. And that is one of the elements of Old Norse culture, this hospitality. That's a key part of Norse culture. And to me, the beliefs of the pre-Proto-Indo-Europeans must have had this hospitality culture within the hunter-gathering state, and that must have spread, say, to the Americas, to the Indian subcontinent, to Siberia, to Europe. And that makes me feel good that inherently we're good people, want to be hospitable, want to tell good stories, want to share these things. And that's me, that's the story that really makes me happy knowing that.
Someone says, Frogsy, thank you for the super chat.
Thanks, Frogsy.
Derek, thank you for your work. Great guest today, as usual. Seriously, though, John, you're a wealth of knowledge on this topic. And I got to say it again for my friend Nate. He's trying to reach 100 subscribers before Friday, everybody, so that he can actually change the name. I'm going to butcher this, Nate, so forgive me. But become a subscriber. Put it that way. Let's get him over 100 subscribers ASAP, please. He's also doing comedy on this channel, Crash the Party. So go check it out. That he's right here in the comment section. Please look him up and go subscribe. John, one thing I'd like to say as an ex-fundamentalist Christian evangelical who read things literally, it would be really, really funny and sad at the same time if people read this and said, cows are princesses. I'm going to go marry me a cow. You know what I'm saying?
It's because they both give milk, literally. That translation changed from that. And that's how Tiamat came about. So we found a fifth tablet of the Enuma Elish, a new one, and that said that Tiamat had udders and lived in sort of muddy grass and had a tail like a cow. And that's how we gave a real connection between the Enuma Elish and this Proto-Indo-European creation myth of the cow being a sacrificial thing. And so therefore, when Genesis then takes the Enuma Elish story in its first couple of verses, boom, there you go, a real direct, tangible link between Genesis and the Proto-Indo-European religion.
Well, thank you so much, man. This is exciting. We got a lot more to do. I would like to do a show. I mentioned this last time when I was in English honors in high school. It's the only honors class that I ever did, I think. There's a story about, I can't believe I don't remember this folktale. It's definitely in the Indo-European, if I'm not mistaken, and the Anglo-Saxon myth of a serpent-type beast whose mother and the child comes to try and rape. Yes, Beowulf. Can we do a show on that?
Absolutely. I've just done a video on that. So it's part of the dragon myth. So yeah, I can recommend some great books on that and talk about it.
I love that story, by the way. That story
is an incredible story. It is a brilliant story. Yeah, really good. Stood the test of time.
Let's do
absolutely.
It.
Yeah, absolutely, Derek. I'd love to do that. I'd really love to do that.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, go and subscribe to Crecganford, please. I ask you, help grow his channel. this content. He just keeps putting out wonderful, wonderful work. Lots of visuals in these videos to try and educate you. Like, look, there's maps, right? So he's showing you locales. He's going into great depth into these stories and showing you. And one of the biggest things I like about you, John, is that you're not a dogmatic, like you recognize that some of this is speculation and you know, you're just trying to be as honest and fair and balanced as you can and trying to say, this is what some scholars think here. This is what some scholars, I like to think this for this reason or whatever. But you're not, you have a balanced approach and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate your feedback. We really enjoy this.
Thank you, man. Let's do this again. Ladies and gentlemen, go down in the description, subscribe to his channel. I appreciate you guys tuning in, the super chats and all the comments and questions and compliments about my amazing model haircut today. You know, it's just amazing. You know, I literally didn't even have time to do my hair. I was like, I gotta get on the show right now. But thank you so much, everybody, and don't forget, we are Myth Vision.